Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast today. Today we're going to look at the effects in Africa of the slave trade in the Atlantic system. And then we're going to sort of preview something that you're going to be doing on your own immediately following this. But anytime we talk about Africa, I feel compelled to remind you that Africa is much, much larger than we think it is. It's so much larger. It's so large, in fact, remember that according to the College Board, there's at least five, six, if you count Madagascar, uh, different regions within Africa itself. But the big thing I want to focus on for right now is how does the slave trade affect the societies in Africa? And then I want to sort of preview a little bit about what you're going to do in terms of how the slave trade affects the African states politically within several different regions. But before we get to that, let's sort of back up a little bit. We know that slavery is not something new. It wasn't invented after 1450. And even within Africa itself, it's not something totally new. It was frequently the case that criminals or conquered peoples would become slaves, but in almost every instance, the slaves would serve as domestic servants. In other words, they're doing work in the house, cooking, cleaning, washing, serving, things of that nature. And in a context in which the private ownership of land was not very common in traditional African societies, the way that you accumulate wealth or the way that you demonstrate your wealth is by the number of slaves that you have. Again, even if they're working as domestic servants, the larger the force of required laborers, coerced laborers you have that are serving your household, the greater your wealth. Now, with the advent of Islam in the post classical period, this increases the demand for slaves within Africa itself. But again, almost entirely, those slaves were used as domestic servants. In fact, within Dar al Islam, particularly during the caliphates, the idea of sort of collecting slaves as domestic servants from as many different regions as possible became a kind of fashionable display of your wealth. But there's a key concept in terms of Islam and its relationship to slavery, and that is the idea that the servant, the slave, is still considered a human being. And the owner of the slave was required to convert that human being to Islam insofar as they believed that was the one true faith. And moreover, they were required to free that person before his or her death. This is a process called manumission, granting freedom to your slaves. Now, in truth, it's usually, not uncommon the practice that you would wait until the slave was going to die at the end of his or her life to free them. But what is clear here is the notion that the condition of slavery could be passed from one generation to another is something that is really, really, really uncommon before this time period. And so, even as Europeans did not invent slavery or even slavery within Africa, it is clearly the case that they are changing the dynamics of the practice of slavery. In one sense, that is for the uses of these slaves. More and more, they are used for very intense, very dangerous physical labor, particularly in plantations, occasionally in mines, although more often than not, those would be Native Americans who are forced through various means to do so. But again, they're doing physical work much more than domestic servants were in previous time periods. Another new development is the notion of chattel slavery, which, if you think about it, is essentially treating human beings as if they are livestock animals. And this is where we get things like the idea that the children born of slaves are also themselves the property of the slave owner who gave birth to that child. And again, this is something that's very, very different. But the biggest difference is the sheer volume of the trade. Just the number of people that are forced into slavery, many of whom die in the Middle Passage and then are worked to death in sugar plantations when they get to America. It's just astonishing how many people we are talking about relative to previous times. Now, on the slide, it says follow the link. I'm going to include the link in Schoology below, but it's a very interesting graphic. You can actually see exactly which ships are going where and how many humans are the cargo on those ships. And the composite image of that is pretty staggering in terms of the number of people. So, okay, if that's the case, then how does this new form of slavery affect the societies within Africa itself during this time period? Well, the main issue is obviously one of demographics. Now, an interesting comparison here is when we think of demographics, we think of populations, and certainly it is the case that the general population in Africa is in large part, a large portion of the general population is deliberately shipped to the Americas. It's not quite so dramatic as what happened with the Native Americans in the so-called Great Dying, the mass uh, death and disease, or death as a consequence of disease, has happened in the Americas. But it did definitely decrease the general population. But specifically, it is mostly about boys and young men. And it kind of makes sense if you consider that the majority of them are going to work in sugar plantations. And so it's the boys and the young men who are most likely to do the most productive work from the perspective of the slave owner before he meets his demise. So then that leads to some questions then about, well, what are the responses to that in terms of gender? If the majority of the people that are literally being shipped out of Africa are male, what happens to the females left behind? Well, in most societies, this means that patriarchy is going to get worse. For example, in many, many of the societies in Africa, polygamy becomes even more pronounced. There's simply more women than there are men, so the fewer number of men are getting more and more wives, not just as a show of their wealth and their status, but it's just a numbers game. On the other hand, though, there are a few cases where women actually gain greater freedoms because women, in many cases, are also forced to become the head of the household as well as just the leader inside the house raising the children. Women are given access to more economic opportunities to trade, to be independent workers, if you will. And again, that's not true everywhere, but the point is that it's not uniformly the same all throughout Africa. And another consequence of this has to do with social rivalries. For example, in many African societies, the slave trade encourages certain ethnic groups who are looking down on other ethnicities and literally trying to capture them to sell them into slavery to boost their own status. Similarly, we see in several societies the elites, who many of whom are religious converts in many cases to Islam, but also to Christianity, who are then sort of looking down on the commoners, many of whom are still practicing traditional animist practices and beliefs, and then feel justified in sort of capturing them and then selling them into slaveries. So the societal effects, while significant and widespread, they're also very, very diverse in many different parts of Africa. Similarly, in terms of the effect that slavery has on the politics of Africa, except for we can see, especially if we step back further in time, some common patterns. For example, as happened in Eurasia, in much of Africa, there's this trend as chiefs become kings, and then kings want to build empires, and so they have to go conquer other people and other territories. But what is the twist here is this system in the time of the Atlantic slave trade starts to turn into a systemic warfare. It creates a kind of feedback loop that simply exacerbates all of the political problems. Excuse me. Such as kings who want to build empires will conquer other people and then use them as slaves, which they will then sell to Europeans for guns. And then the gunpowder is used to create even larger territories and even more conquest, which in turn creates more captured people to become slaves, to get more guns, to get more territory, to get more slaves, to get more guns, and so on. So again, we can see this feedback loop that is literally turning African states and empires on other Africans, whether they're in a state or not. And the bottom line of this is Europe is the one that's fueling this sort of feedback loop. It is their demand for the slaves as well as their use of guns as a way to purchase those slaves that's really driving all of this. It also is another example, though, about how we've seen throughout this time period the role of gunpowder as a source of political authority. Yeah, it's used to expand empires, but then it's also creating a situation where now that you've got gunpowder, you have to have much more control over your people in order to keep it from being used against you. Politically, the effect of the slave trade then is going to alter the balance of power within Africa itself for several centuries. And many have argued that it is still not fully recovered from that. And we'll get into this much more after the Christmas break, because immediately after this period is when we get European imperialism throughout Africa and the division of Africa, the so-called scramble for Africa, and then the colonial consequences thereafter. These are literally processes that are affecting African politics for centuries hereafter. Now, here's what's going on after this. On the back of this sheet, you've got some 6 different regions that we're going to take a look at. How does slavery affect the politics? And all I want to do, you're just going to read those on your own, but I want to make sure you can understand and visualize where these are. The first of these is what is called the Gold Coast, which is like the southern coast of that part of West Africa that juts out to the west towards the Americas into the Atlantic. That southern part is called the Gold Coast because of the fact that Europeans could get the gold there as opposed to it being transported across the Saharan desert. That also, though, becomes an important spot in the slave trade. And so there's a people there, the Asante or Ashanti or Asante. You'll see variations of all of those. It's the same people. And then we're going to take a look at, in Central Africa, the Kingdom of the Congo. And that's an interesting case because their leader actually converts to Christianity and he resists the role of Europeans in the slave trade and the effects it's having on him. Then we'll look at the Cape Colony in what will become South Africa. The region is Southern Africa. And if you recall, the Cape Colony was originally the possession of the Portuguese, who discovered the Cape of Good Hope in the first place. But as with many other places throughout the world, the Dutch will eventually take it over. Then we'll look at the Swahili coast in East Africa. Remember, these are Islamic city-states that are blending Bantu and Arab culture. What are the consequences of the slave trade there? Then we'll move to North Africa. most of which is controlled by the Ottoman Empire. So, what's their role in all of this? But in the western part of North Africa, there's also a people called the Berbers who have been Muslims themselves for quite a long time. They're putting pressure then on the last that we'll look at, the Songhai or Songhai in West Africa. So again, you've got sort of easy reading little snippets about how slavery affects each of those 6 states in different regions throughout Africa. You're sort of on your own in terms of reading those. I tried to make it it's dense with information, but hopefully not very hard to read. That is my intent. And then for those of you in my class, the end of the week, you will have focus questions on both the slides that you just annotated and the little snippets about different states and empires within Africa. I want to thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon.